It may take an hour just to go over the pituitary gland because it's such a complex endocrine structure. But first of all, we need to know that the pituitary gland is made of two main parts, the anterior pituitary, which is called the adenohypophysis. Hypophysis means to grow under, and adeno refers to the fact that the anterior pituitary gland is made of glandular tissue, whereas the posterior pituitary down here, also called the neurohypophysis, it's derived from different embryonic tissue altogether, and as the name suggests, it is made of neural tissue. So we have the adenohypophysis made of glandular tissue, the neurohypophysis made of neural tissue. So these are the hormones that are made by the adenohypophysis, and you should know all these hormones and their effects, what causes them to be released, and also their abbreviations. We'll start off with the fact that the adenohypophysis makes this thing called pro-opiomelanocortin, which is a precursor to melanocyte-stimulating hormone. We won't be going over melanocyte-stimulating hormone in this chapter, but to know that this pro-opiomelanocortin can also become endorphins, and you know those and enkephalins as pain. They help to relieve pain, like you hear about a runner's high when they release endorphins to help cope with pain, etc. So that is a hormone that either becomes melanocyte-stimulating hormone through one pathway, or endorphins or enkephalins. The hormone that you'll need to know in this chapter is called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and here we go down here. We'll cover it here in a few minutes. So this first is just a side note. In case you have curiosity in the future, you can read all about that. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These guys, both of these, follicle stimulating, here's how it's abbreviated, luteinizing, these are called gonadotropins. Now, remember in a previous lecture, we said that tropins act upon. So this follicle stimulating hormone acts upon the gonads. This luteinizing hormone is a gonadotropin, so it acts upon the gonads. From the last lecture, we found that some hormones are released because of a hormonal stimulus or a neural stimulus or humoral. In this case, these are hormones that'll go to the gonads and tell them to release hormones. So these are definitely tropins. They're acting on other endocrine organs. The thyroid stimulating hormone, as the name suggests, it's going to stimulate the thyroid gland. So it acts upon, it's a hormone that acts upon the thyroid. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, tropic, adrenal cortex. So this is a hormone that acts upon the adrenal cortex to tell the adrenal cortex to release its hormones. Okay, so we have FSH, LH, TSH, ACTH. These are the first four hormones we're going to be learning about. I'm not sure about the order actually that I'm going to go with this lecture, but prolactin, as the name suggests, here's its abbreviation, and growth hormone. These are pretty straightforward. Prolactin is pro-lactation. It's going to have some other roles, but also growth hormones for growth. And in the neurohypophysis, it does not make hormones. The hormones that are, it stores them though, just stores and releases. It is going to store and release oxytocin, which is going to be made in the hypothalamus, and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin very specifically is made in the paraventricular nucleus. I'm very proud of how I write now. It looks so much readable. Paraventricular nucleus. Remember, a nucleus in the central nervous system is a cluster of cell bodies. So the paraventricular nucleus is a cluster of neuronal cell bodies that actually makes a hormone, oxytocin. And then the hormone's going to slide down the axon and be stored into the neurohypophysis. So this guy right here is in the hypothalamus. ADH is also made in the hypothalamus by the supraoptic nucleus, a different region altogether. So both of these are in the hypothalamus. They make the hormones that you see over to the left, oxytocin and ADH, and then the hormones go down to the neurohypophysis where they're stored. The anterior pituitary In a nutshell, the anterior pituitary, the stimulus for release of its hormones is going to be a hormonal stimulus. For the neurohypophysis, the stimulus for release of oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, that is going to be a neural stimulus. So different ways that the hormones are released from these different areas of the organ. Now here we have, see this little pituitary here? Looks pretty benign. It's little, it sits in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. It has this little stalk here called the infundibulum. And here is the actual hypothalamus. Remember, this is the thalamus up here. Here's the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to control all aspects of the pituitary gland through that infundibulum. And then when the pituitary gland releases its hormones, of course, as all hormones do, they're going to travel through the blood. So let's look. Why is the posterior pituitary, this area, different from the anterior pituitary? Well, because embryonically, they're developed from different regions. In the pharynx, this oral mucosa becomes the anterior pituitary, and down from the hypothalamus, we grow the posterior pituitary. And so this is all neural tissue, and this is all ends up being glandular tissue. Look at these neurons up here. They're sending their little axons down to different places. The ones that are coming all the way down here to the posterior pituitary should be the axons from the paraventricular and the supraoptic nuclei. Remember that those guys, the neurons up here in the hypothalamus, make antidiuretic hormone and they make oxytocin, and they're just stored here. So what we have to do to get oxytocin or ADH to be released, we send a little action potential down. So both of these hormones it's a neural stimulus that causes them to be released. But we can go even further beyond that and say, while there's a neural stimulus that causes them to be released, like with antidiuretic hormone, there's going to be a trigger that causes the action potential to go. And we'll find with ADH, for instance, there's something behind that neural stimulus in the fact that blood volume or blood pressure drops, and that stimulates the hypothalamus to release that neural stimulus. Okay, here are two posterior pituitary hormones, and we'll go through them individually, but it's showing you the organs that they affect. The antidiuretic hormone is going to affect the kidney tubules, and oxytocin will affect the uterus for childbirth, and the breast for something called a letdown reflex. Now in the anterior pituitary, it's all made of glandular tissue. Look at this nice blood supply. Here, we have a nice blood supply coming from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary, because how we control the release of growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating or the luteinizing hormone, melanocyte stimulating hormone, we're skimming over that, and prolactin. The way that the anterior pituitary is stimulated to release all of these hormones is because up here in the hypothalamus, a different group of neurons will send what are called releasing hormones into the blood, and they'll go straight down to the anterior pituitary and cause all of these hormones in the beige boxes over here to be released. So we have a neural stimulus on this side, and all of these hormones, we have a hormonal stimulus for their actual release. Up here histologically, these histological sections, you can see how pretty the anterior pituitary is. If you see it, you have so many different cell types in there, right? You've got cells that make the growth hormone, and you've got different cells that make ACTH, and different cells that make TCH, and et cetera. So it stains really pretty when you're looking at the anterior pituitary. Whereas the posterior pituitary, it just looks, it's kind of boring because it's just neural tissue altogether. Excuse me. Okay, I drew this. I'm so proud of this. This is an original piece of artwork, but this supraoptic nucleus, this is showing you, here's the anterior pituitary, the adenohypophysis. Here is the neurohypophysis. As I said on that last slide, the neurohypophysis is going to release ADH. Of course, it switched sides from the last time, and oxytocin. In the last slide, the neurohypophysis was on the other side, on the left side of the adeno, so pay attention. Keeping you on your toes. If we want oxytocin and ADH to be released, we have to send an action potential through a tract. Now, remember that a tract is a nerve, but we call them nerves in the peripheral nervous system, in the central nervous system, and we are in the central nervous system because this stalk right here, this hypothalamic-hypophyseal tract, is a nerve that's running through this infundibulum to zap these cells down here to cause the release of oxytocin. So the hypothalamus controls the release of the neurohypophysis through action potentials. The hypothalamus controls the adenohypophysis through releasing hormones. We're just going to ignore inhibiting hormones because life is hard enough as it is. But if a releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus, it tells the anterior pituitary to release its hormone. For instance, if we release growth hormone, releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, it goes through the blood to the anterior pituitary, and then it tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. That's how the releasing hormones are going to work. I drew this SO nucleus and PV nucleus, ventral nucleus, up here for a reason. This is where all of the releasing hormones are made and released into the blood to get down to the anterior pituitary. This PV stands for the paraventricular nucleus. This is the nucleus that's actually going to make oxytocin. And the supraoptic nucleus up here in the hypothalamus is the nucleus, the group of cell bodies that creates ADH. Okay, so this is in a nutshell how we control the release of the adeno and the neurohypophyseal hormones. Now, this is a very fascinating story that we're about to get into, and it's very exciting to anybody who's into anatomy and physiology, because the way that blood flow normally goes, let's start, everybody knows the aorta. Here is the aorta, the largest artery in the body, and this left ventricle is going to contract, and you can't see the start of the aorta, but the blood goes into the aorta, and it's going to go either up to the head and the neck, in the upper limbs, or it's going to go down to the bottom of the body and everywhere below the diaphragm. So we're sending this fresh oxygenated blood to the tissues of the body. And here's a capillary bed. This is what we're representing, a capillary bed. Well, that oxygen is dropped off to the tissues say the head. And then carbon dioxide, because we're continually making it, is picked up from the tissues and put into the blood, carried back to the other side of the heart. So let's go this way. Here's a big toe. There's your big toe. You need to cut your big toe now. Anyway. It looks like somebody stepped on your big toe. Okay, anyway, there's your big toe. There's a capillary in the big toe, in the tissues of the big toe. And we're going to send freshly oxygenated blood down to the big toe. And we're going to release the oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide, and that blood full of carbon dioxide is going to return to the heart. Now we return to the heart up here, like just from the head down and from the foot up into the right atrium. And then we go into the right ventricle, and then we're going to send that blood to the lungs. Well, the reason, notice there's no oxygen in this. What we're doing is we're picking up oxygen and sending it back to the left side of the heart. We're going to go over this again in the cardiovascular system. There's a pulmonary circuit. So the right side of your heart sends unoxygenated, high carbon dioxide blood to the lungs. So we can take a breath out, get rid of the carbon dioxide, and when we take a breath in, we can fill that blood in the lungs up with oxygen and take that oxygenated blood back to the left side. Here's the left side of the heart. Here's the right side. And so this oxygenated blood will be pumped to the entire body, the head, the neck, the toes, wherever, the big toe, etc. So when we send that oxygenated blood out, it's not like this blood that is now low oxygen and high carbon dioxide on the way back from the toe is going to go to tissues, a capillary bed in the knee, and then a capillary bed in the liver, and then back to the heart. Each unit of blood will go through one capillary bed and head back to the heart. That way, all your tissues get fully oxygenated blood. What I'm saying, if we drew this and dumbed it down even more, we would say blood leaves the heart, goes through one capillary bed, whether that's in the liver or whether that's in the big toe or wherever, and then it's going to go straight back to the heart. Here we have high oxygen blood, it's low carbon dioxide, and it reverses on this side, high carbon dioxide, low oxygen. It's not going to go through two capillary beds before it gets there. Doesn't work like that, just one capillary bed. That's normal blood flow. Interestingly, though, if we have a hypothalamus and it has hormones that are going to affect this pituitary gland. As the blood goes through the hypothalamus, if it goes through a capillary bed, then it will have to go back to the heart before the heart can pump it up to the lungs to pick up the oxygen, drop off the carbon dioxide. So we'd have to go heart, and then we'd have to go lungs, and then the blood would return to the heart, and then the heart would take that blood to a capillary bed in the pituitary. If we're the hypothalamus and we want to control something so very close to us, why would we bother doing all that? We don't. We end up making a really specialized system where we do have two capillary beds like this in a row. Let's take a look at that. So then if we have two capillary beds in a row, we have a capillary bed, and then we have a little connector to this capillary bed. So we can send our hormones directly to the pituitary through a little, what's called a portal vein. So here's capillary bed 1. Let's say this is in the hypothalamus. And in the hypothalamus, we're going to put releasing hormones into the blood, and we want to affect the pituitary. We put those releasing hormones into what's called into a portal vein, because it's a portal to the second capillary bed. This is a unique setup, and this second capillary bed will be straight in the pituitary, specifically the adenohypophysis, the anterior pituitary. So the releasing hormones can go straight from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, and then the pituitary can release the hormones into the blood, and then it goes through the heart to the pulmonary circuit, and then back to the heart and through the rest of the body. So this term portal system, in a portal system, we have two capillary beds. That's unusual, and they're connected by what's called a portal vein. This is going to come up in the digestive system, so it's good to start understanding why we have systems like this in the first place. Okay, let's do the neurohypophysis and what causes the release of hormones from there. Okay, so here we have the posterior pituitary in the back, and how do I know that that's the posterior pituitary? We have these hypothalamic neurons in the supraoptic nucleus. So that means if it's a supraoptic nucleus, it makes ADH in this very specific example. These neurons make antidiuretic hormone, and they slide down these axons, and they're stored in here. When we send an action potential, that's AP, then it zaps this neurohypophysis, and the neurons go into the blood and into the target tissues. Of course, it has to go to the heart first. But notice this is the hypothalamic, because it's coming from the hypothalamus to the hypophyseal. I don't spell it that way. Track, that's a nerve going from the hypothalamus to the hypophysis. And so when we zap this neurohypophysis, it releases the hormones into the blood. And the two hormones we're talking about could either be ADH or oxytocin. These neurohypophyseal hormones are made in the hypothalamus. And which hormones made by the paraventricular nucleus? Oxytocin. Which hormones made by the supraoptic nucleus? ADH. These are the two hormones made there. So this is clearly the release for oxytocin and the release from ADH, because it's a little electric zap to this organ here. It is a neural stimulus. For the adenohypophysis, we have a hormonal stimulus. Here are the hypothalamic neurons from the ventral nucleus and the hypothalamus, and they are making releasing hormones. Now I'm ignoring inhibiting hormones. I'm just going to ignore those. It's easier to do that. When these hormones release releasing hormones, they go through the blood. Now here's the first capillary bed right here up in the hypothalamus, and they're going to go through the portal vein, see, hypothalamic-hypophyseal portal system. They go through this portal vein down to the second capillary bed, and these releasing hormones cause the cells in the actual adenohypophysis to release their hormones to go out to the actual body. Okay, so what hormones triggered the release of the adenohypophyseal hormones? Releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. What is a portal system? A portal system is a system where we are designed to get blood from one organ directly to another, bypassing all the normal blood flow. And so it's composed usually of a capillary bed, a portal vein, and another capillary bed. So here's our first capillary bed, our portal vein, our second capillary bed. Why are many of the hypophyseal hormones called tropic hormones? So the hormones that are going to be released here would be like follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, prolactin. Of these hormones, this one, this one, this one, and this one, these guys are the tropic hormones because they actually act upon, to be called a tropic hormone, you have to act upon another endocrine organ. Endocrine organ. Growth hormone and prolactin do not act on other endocrine organs, so they're not considered tropic hormones. So we call the follicle stimulating and luteinizing because they act on the gonads. We call those gonadotropins. We call the thyroid stimulating hormone thyrotropins because they act upon the thyroid. ACTH, adrenocorticotropins is ACTH. All right, so we're up to our first hormone that is stored in the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin is released with a neural stimulus, and what it's going to do is two things. It's going to cause uterine contraction during childbirth. So here we have what's going to happen is at some point during the pregnancy, all through the pregnancy, as the uterus is getting larger and larger and larger, it is developing more receptors on the cells for the hormone called oxytocin. And once the uterus gets to a certain size, then it sends a message. Let's draw my own picture. Here's the uterus, hollow organ. Here's a pretty baby in there. It's apparently going to be a breech. When we're pressing out on the uterine walls, at some point, this uterus just says, I'm done. And it sends a message up to the hypothalamus and it says, just do it. Just release the oxytocin. So the hypothalamus zaps the posterior pituitary, and the oxytocin goes to the uterus and causes the uterus to contract. Now, when the uterus contracts, the next time, what's going to happen is that uterus contracts, it sends an even stronger, we started off with this strength, 1+. It's going to send a stronger signal to the hypothalamus saying, I'm done. I said, I'm done. And then we're going to get a bigger release of oxytocin. So our contractions are going to grow in strength. They're going to become more and more powerful. This is our example of positive feedback. This is our example of positive feedback, homeostasis through positive feedback. And so we release more and more oxytocin to the uterine contractions are so fierce that you can actually hold your baby there within a few minutes afterwards. Childbirth occurs. Now, the letdown reflex is quite different. The letdown reflex has to do with after you've already made milk. If you've made milk and you're going to breastfeed an infant, The milk is inside the breast. You've made it because of prolactin, a different hormone, but it just won't come out until we release oxytocin. Oxytocin will go to the myoepithelial cells of the breast, and it will cause them to not only contract, but also allow the milk out. And so you often hear women say they're engorged when they can't breastfeed their baby because the milk won't come out. But the interesting thing about this is as soon as you think about your baby, this letdown reflex occurs. The brain releases oxytocin. It causes the milk to be ejected from the breast. That's why a lot of brand new breastfeeding mothers don't realize how strong this reflex is. If you see a baby raccoon and you think it's cute, if you hear a different baby crying and you're like, oh, just anything that makes you go, oh, it's going to cause this letdown reflex. So it's important when you breastfeed to be relaxed so you can actually allow the release of oxytocin and then the letdown of the milk so the milk can come out. Now ask up here, where is this hormone made? We should know this by now. It is made in the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. There are some other roles associated with oxytocin, like sexual arousal and satisfaction, orgasm, and it's also called the cuddling hormone. Both men and women release oxytocin, just so you know that. Even though men don't have uterus, they do have breast tissue. I'm not saying there's going to be a letdown reflex, but it's called the cuddling hormone for a reason. We all experience the feeling of oxytocin. The reason I put her in here is because sometimes if your childbirth is not progressing to, I guess, the satisfaction of the hospital staff, they will give you a shot of oxytocin. I'm a horrible patient. I scream like a banshee when I'm in labor and delivery. And so they gave me lots of Pitocin to get me in and out the door as fast as possible. So Pitocin, P-I-T-O-C-I-N, is a synthetic form of oxytocin to cause strong uterine contractions if they don't think you are progressing as fast as they would like you to progress. Okay, our second neurohypophyseal hormone, and I can't stress enough, you need to read the book. This is not enough information. You definitely need to read the book 3 or 4 times and watch these videos and come to class and all that stuff to be in practice and write this stuff down and self-quiz to be able to be fluent in the endocrine system. Okay, if you're taking a straight up online class, quiz yourself, walk around, talk to yourself when you're in the grocery store, talk about the difference between the different stimuli for the hormones, etc. Unless you can talk it to yourself without looking at notes, you don't know it. Okay, antidiuretic hormone. As this name suggests, it is against diuresis. If you take a diuretic, what do? You urinate a lot. This hormone is specifically designed to prevent you from producing too much urine. There's a stimulus that causes it to be released, but here we go. As if we have a blood vessel, let's say, here's the amount of blood in it. Now let's do this. There's the amount of blood in it. If we have less blood volume, how do I describe this osmolarity? Here's how I'm going to do it. We have a beaker of salt water. We're at the beach. We get the water straight out of the ocean, and it's about 95 degrees, and we let it sit outside for days. And what happens is the water will evaporate off until it eventually even goes away. But what's not going to evaporate off and go away is the salt. So if we just wait in the sun and this volume goes down due to evaporation of the water, then this solution B, is going to have a higher concentration of salts than solution A. It's going to have a higher osmolarity. So just assume that if our blood volume drops, if we're dehydrated, we'll do the same thing. Our blood volume will drop, and that causes blood pressure to drop. Now, if we're hemorrhaging, we're not going to have a saltier solution, right? So there are 2 different ways that if we can lose blood volume through hemorrhaging, or we could be dehydrated, etc. But if we decrease blood volume, we will decrease blood pressure. And so as the blood goes to the hypothalamus, we have osmoreceptors to sample the blood. Is this blood too salty? Is it? If it is, that must mean our blood volume's down and our blood pressure's down, and we need to do something about it. Likewise, we have baroreceptors. If just blood pressure is down, then we need to do something about it. So these receptors up in the hypothalamus will cause this neuron right here to zap the posterior pituitary. This neuron is making antidiuretic hormone and storing it here, and that ADH is released. And what happens is that ADH goes to the kidneys, and it tells the kidneys to put more water back in the blood. So the kidneys are making urine. And when you're making urine, you can decide, do I want to keep all the water in the urine, or can I put some back into the blood? That's, if you put it back into the blood, it's called resorption. So when the kidney tubules, what they'll do is they'll resorb water. They'll take the water out of the urine, because down here in the bladder, it's too late. The kidneys have to do this. The kidneys take the water out of the urine, put it into the blood, and then that will increase blood volume. Now the urine becomes more concentrated, but our blood, we increase our blood volume and increase our blood pressure. That's the whole story of ADH. No, it's not. I'm just kidding. But I'll just tell you this. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, increases blood volume by putting water from the kidneys back into the blood, because we're going to come into another hormone that does something different. It's going to take salt out of the urine, put it into the blood, and then water will follow. So this is a very direct mechanism with antidiuretic hormone. Sometimes we release a lot of antidiuretic hormone when we drink a lot of let's see, wait, where should I start? Here's where we produce a lot. If you have low blood pressure, then let's say you're hemorrhaging, you'll make a lot of antidiuretic hormone. And in that case, when you release massive amounts of it, it's called vasopressin, because it can also cause the blood vessels to constrict. And if we have blood vessels that are like this, with this amount of blood in it, because you're hemorrhaging, they can constrict, and that amount of blood now looks like this amount of blood, and it automatically increases your blood pressure. So sometimes people don't call it ADH, they just call it vasopressin, because of that strong vasoconstrictive effect that it has to increase blood pressure. Certain drugs can cause an increase in ADH production, so you have higher blood pressure. If you have low blood pressure in itself, like say this example here, where you're hemorrhaging, that will release ADH. Sometimes when you're in pain, that can cause the release of ADH. What inhibits the release of ADH is alcohol. And you may know this if you've ever had alcohol before, that you freely go to the bathroom because alcohol will inhibit the release of antidiuretic hormone. So everything you're drinking will just run right through you, and so will more. So if you spend a night out drinking, the next day the hangover is truly just losing tons of blood volume and putting yourself in a dehydrated state. It does not feel good. Okay, if you get head injury, sometimes you can develop something called diabetes insipidus. That's not the same kind of diabetes that increases your blood sugar levels. Diabetes insipidus is the kind where you might as well be drinking alcohol all the time, because you lose your blood volume all the time. You're constantly urinating, so you constantly have to drink to replace that. So it mimics the other symptoms of diabetes mellitus. Sometimes surgeries can cause syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, hypersecretion, and a person with that, like that, would have high blood pressure, would retain a lot of water, and that's about it. Okay, I think we're on to the anterior pituitary gland. I'm going to cut this video short, and we're going to start the anterior pituitary on the next video, because it's really a lot to focus on.